Jeff Bezos was a vice president of an investment company. He was born into a very poor family who loved him very much. He was born when his mother was 17 years old. His father came from Cuba and could not speak English. His father moved to America when he was 16. Besides his parents, Jeff was also raised by his grandparents who also loved him very much. No wonder that with such a family, he grew up to be someone with big dreams and perseverance. In 1994 in New York, Jeff was busy working and forgot that he had a meeting with David, his boss, that afternoon. Luckily, Nico, his friend, reminded him to go straight to the meeting room. During the meeting, David discussed the high profits of their office in the first quarter. Therefore, he wanted to expand the reach of his office with new innovations. One of the employees had given the idea to bring the investment system online, but David was still looking for another idea. Besides that, David emphasized that all ideas must be based on data so that the advantages and disadvantages of the idea could be analyzed properly. After the meeting, Jeff started his research by reading many articles on the internet until he found an article that stated that in that year, the internet had grown by 2,300%. Therefore, he thought that he should immediately take advantage of this. That night, Jeff chatted with his wife. She worked as a secretary in the same office, but even though she liked her job, she missed her old hobby of writing. All this time, she was bored but had to keep working because it's the source of their income. It turned out that Jeff was also experiencing the same thing. He had been dreaming of establishing a new company, but on the other hand, he didn't want to sacrifice his very brilliant career. His wife actually supported him to start his new company. She tried to convince him that he could do it. After receiving support and encouragement from his wife, Jeff shared the results of his research about the growth of the internet. He had counted that if he started his business from the internet, he would have a large income, but unfortunately, Jeff hadn't found the thing people were looking for most that had the potential to make a very big business. The next day, Jeff did field research observing people's activities and researching to find business loopholes that could be taken advantage of via the internet. After that, at night, Jeff sorted through the ideas he recorded. Unfortunately, he didn't click with any of the ideas he had. He then remembered his wife who loved to write. At that moment, Jeff was thinking of researching the book industry. The next morning, Jeff did his research again. He went straight to the library to emphasize his idea about the book industry. While doing his research, Jeff observed the towering bookshelves, and at that very moment he realized that there was limited space while a large number of books were written and published every year, which means not all books could be accommodated in libraries or bookstores. Based on his research, Jeff expressed his opinion on David. He got the idea to sell books via the internet and even completed his idea with data and profit calculations as requested by David yesterday. He said that currently physical bookstores were very limited and therefore he wanted to open an online-based bookstore and that will not be constrained by space or time. But unfortunately, David did not welcome the idea but still wanted to consider it because he found the idea interesting. An hour later, David returned to Jeff only to convey disappointed news. Though we considered that Jeff's idea was smart and very ambitious, online bookstores did not have a good future, especially since the current bookkeeping industry had been controlled by Barnes & Noble, the biggest and most advanced bookstore in the country. And if Jeff insisted on selling books online, David worried that the business would not last long. At night, Jeff came home earlier than his wife. He felt discouraged after David rejected his idea outright. His wife felt sorry for him. She tried to cheer her husband and told him that he was the smartest person she knew. He managed to get a high position at the age of only 30 years, and because of that, she believed that whatever Jeff does would definitely work. Finally, after his confidence returned, Jeff decided to try the online bookstore business opportunities and even to start his business. He intended to resign from his job even though he already had an established life. He still wanted to reach his dream, and for that, he asked his wife to resign from her job, saying that he didn't want to work all alone, especially when he needed support in achieving his goals. Besides that, Jeff's wife could go back to having fun with her hobby of writing. Without wasting more time the next day, Jeff immediately contacted all his acquaintances and asked them to become investors in his new business. But unfortunately, many rejected him and were not interested in investing there. In the evening, Jeff calculated that the capital he had collected was only $50,000. That amount was still far from his target and was too small to start a business. After a deadlock, Jeff finally sold his house, and because of that, he returned to his parents' house. His parents welcomed Jeff and his wife warmly. At first, his parents thought that their son was coming home because he wanted to announce his wife's pregnancy, but he was not. Jeff told them that he and his wife had resigned from their job to kickstart a new business, namely an online bookstore. Jeff explained that the internet had become very promising and therefore wanted to take advantage of it. After explaining everything, Jeff said his real intention was to invite his parents to be the first investors in his business. He even calculated the profit that could be obtained if the company was a big success. But if it fails, Jeff promised to return the capital from his parents as much as 70%. After hearing Jeff's explanation, his mother was surprised. She doubted her son's decision because it was very risky, especially since Jeff didn't work anywhere anymore and was now unemployed. But after all, after considering the savings and retirement money, his parents decided to be his first investors. The next day, Jeff's father gave him some money, saying that the money would be his lifesaver, at least for now. Jeff immediately thanked his father and was very happy and touched to see the support from his parents. After that, Jeff needed another help. He wanted to borrow his father's car as their transportation because Jeff and his wife planned to find a new home. Hearing Jeff's request, his father immediately said allowed him to bring the car. During the trip, Jeff continued to work to finalize the concepts and systems of his new company. Even when they arrived at an inn to rest, Jeff was still trying to finish his work. He was analyzing data and thinking about supplying books from Asia. To make things easier, he decided to look for a house in Seattle, Washington. Without wasting more time, Jeff and his wife left for Seattle. It was Jeff's turn to drive until morning. When it was about sunrise, Jeff took his wife to see a very beautiful sunrise. At that moment, Jeff said the name of the company was Cadabra, like in the magic spell. That afternoon, Jeff contacted Paul Davis, a programmer who was an expert in website design. Jeff wanted to maximize his ideas and potential, so he looked for people who are experts and highly dedicated to making it happen. Besides that, Paul suggested his friend named Shel Caffin, a programmer who was good at grouping data. Jeff finally contacted Shel too because he needed Shel's expertise to create a catalog on his book website. After calling Paul and Shel, Jeff saw his wife fast asleep in the passenger seat, and at that moment, he remembered his childhood with his grandparents. He remembered what his grandfather said to him to be happy because he was surrounded by good people who loved him. He was grateful for that. The next day, Jeff waited for Shel to arrive at a cafe. He wanted to talk about business and did a short interview before hiring him. After reading the company profile, Shel was interested in joining, but Jeff warned that the company was still new, so Shel only got a low salary. Besides, working hours and the workload was also very high, but Shel still agreed. He even understood startup companies struggle to penetrate the market and industry, and finally, Shel signed the contract. After Shel left, Jeff and his wife discussed the new house. Jeff wanted a house with a garage because he saw big companies like Disney and Dell starting their company from the garage. Soon, Jeff's wife found a house that matched her husband's wishes from a newspaper advertisement. She immediately called the phone number listed and the transaction was immediately carried out. The next day, Jeff and his wife moved to their new house, and since their main purpose of moving was to start their new company, the first thing they did was check out the garage. They quickly tidied it up and arranged the decor into a proper office. A few days later, Jeff bought some sets of computers and installed electrical installations without any help. To minimize expenses, Jeff even wrote the company name on the garage wall. He could finally rest assured knowing his office had finally started working. And after Shel joined the company, Paul followed him to join Jeff's company and started to follow the workflow of the office. Jeff had planned the contents of his website. He wanted a system that would make it easier for customers to use his website, and because of that, Jeff asked Shel and Paul to realize the plan and give them a deadline so it could be launched before the summer. Upon hearing that, Paul thought that Jeff was a former finance employee who was skilled in programming, but Shel told him that Jeff used to major in it, and that made Paul admire Jeff's intelligence. Shortly after, Jeff also changed the name of the company to relentless.com. While the company's website designing was continuing, Jeff continued to look for investors to invest in his business. But again, he was refused on the grounds that his business was still too new and was considered not mature enough to be a place of investment. Not only Jeff worked hard, but he also forced Paul and Shel to work continuously. He was really ambitious to immediately make his dream come true, but unfortunately, Jeff started to ignore the people around him, including his wife. He was too engrossed in his job and forgot his loved ones and even forgot to take a break. Seeing Jeff like this made his wife reconsider her choice to support him, but on the other side, she tried to understand him and let him do what he wanted to do. The next day, Jeff went to an event held by the American booksellers community in Miami. In the meeting, Jeff introduced himself as the founder of the world's largest bookstore because he intended to sell books via the internet. Jeff also began to call his business an online bookstore. When Jeff was speaking, someone secretly observed him and intended to meet him to discuss a business. After the seminar was over, Jeff was suddenly approached by someone who turned out to be Leonard Riggio, the owner of the largest bookstore in America, Barnes & Noble. At first, Jeff thought that Riggio was interested in becoming an investor in his new business. But Riggio underestimated him and said that his business once started as a small bookstore, until he finally had many branches and became the largest bookstore in America. Riggio told Jeff to know his place, who was just starting his business, and should not call his business the biggest bookstore because he didn't even have one yet. After the event, he returned home in disappointment. He also vented his disappointment to his wife. She couldn't take it anymore and bursted in anger. She expressed her disappointment so far because Jeff was too ambitious and ignored the people around him. She didn't demand to be a priority, but she longed for his love. She even brought up Jeff's invitation to resign to support him. In the middle of the argument, Jeff remembered his childhood with his grandfather. His grandfather told him that appreciation is important, and he felt that it was what his company needed. He wanted to give that impression in his business. He wanted to show that the company would prioritize the customer. He then went back to the office, leaving his wife alone. The next day, Shell and Paul showed up in the office. They were surprised to see Jeff, who was already in the office, even though it was still early. Jeff looked messy, indicating he had worked all night. Jeff then complained that he still didn't like the name of his company and that he wanted to change it but had not found the right name. After hearing Jeff's complaint, Shell suggested a name that started with the letter A because the search engine system on the internet will sort website names according to the alphabet. Jeff hadn't accepted the suggestion, but he instead changed the topic of conversation and started expressing the ideas he got last night. He asked Shell and Paul to design their website with a design that would make consumers feel very valued and prioritized, for example, by bringing up the fastest shipping panel and a selection of bestsellers so that consumers would feel well served. After giving directions to Shell and Paul, Jeff met his wife, who was still angry with him. He apologized and confessed all of his mistakes, knowing he was too engrossed with work. He promised that he would pay more attention to his wife and would involve her in the company. Finally, after forgiving him, his wife asked about the development of the business. He then explained that the idea was being worked on by Paul and Shell. After working day and night, it turned out that Jeff still did not agree with the web design designed by Shell and Paul. Due to fatigue, Shell reminded Jeff that their workload and salaries were not worth it. In addition, Jeff's company advertisements weren't promising, so it was not surprising that no investors were interested in investing in their company. After receiving protests from Shell, Jeff contacted his old friend Nico to join the company. Nico immediately accepted his offer and came to Seattle, but a new problem appeared. Paul said that they were constrained by book distributors who set minimum order rules. Thankfully, Jeff had an idea to overcome this. Since the package delivery payment system in America is payment after shipping, they intended to order two types of books, one book on stock books and the other from empty stock. So later, if the book they ordered arrived, they would only receive and pay for one book from the distributor, and a few days later, this method proved successful. Elsewhere, Leonard Riggio got a call from a friend who told him about Jeff's online bookstore, and after hearing his friend's story, he felt that he had a new competitor. He immediately contacted Jeff to ask to meet. The next day, Jeff waited for Riggio while reading a book. He opened a dictionary and looked for terms that began with the letter A, and from there, Jeff found the word Amazon and began to imagine the Amazon River as the longest river in the world. Jeff thought that the name matched his business. A few moments later, Riggio came, and without further ado, he offered to buy Jeff's idea at a high price, but because Jeff had been belittled by him, his offer was outright refused by Jeff, while intimidating him that he would prove his word as the founder of the world's largest bookstore. After returning home, Jeff's wife asked about the meeting. Jeff said that he refused Riggio. That decision left Shell and Paul protesting, but Jeff stated that the reason was that Riggio's intention to make the offer was because he was afraid of having competitors. The fact that Riggio wanted to pay highly for his idea proved that it was a great idea. Besides, Jeff also said that he had found a suitable name for his company, namely Amazon.com. The word .com was deliberately mentioned to emphasize that bookstores were exclusively only available on the internet. A few weeks later, soon before the summer, Jeff was preparing to release his website. That afternoon, he presented his business in front of the investors. Jeff explained the advantages of online bookstores that could be accessed from anywhere and anytime with no boundaries in space and time because the system is based on the internet network. Thanks to his presentation, Jeff became increasingly confident that his online bookstore business would become the first in the world and would replace conventional bookstores and even big bookstores. After conducting several trials and adding innovations to perfect the website, that afternoon, Jeff and all of his company employees gathered in the garage. They would soon officially launch their website, but even though they had released their business, Jeff and his employees still had to work hard as a new company. At that point, Shell felt pressured because the salary was too low with a very high workload. He complained to Jeff about it, but Jeff reminded him that he had agreed from the start to build this new company, and because of that, he felt his protest was in vain. The next day, Shell intended to leave the company. He had made a resignation letter and was ready to print it, but suddenly a message popped up on their screen, and after checking it, it turned out to be their first book order. All Amazon.com employees were happy because their efforts finally paid off.